Hello patrons, and welcome to this fourth in the series of the 12 days of healing. This is actually using pastel with gouache paint. I've had this set of gouache paint that Arteza has given me for a while, and this was a great opportunity to work with my daughter-in-law. There she is, little cutie pie. She was such a great assistant. We actually cataloged all 60 colors in this set. Again, Arteza gives me these complimentary so that I'll share them in my videos, and it's really great to get these products. So I'm going to be sharing a little bit more about this, but I will have a separate video, very in-depth video on this particular set of gouache paints and all about gouache paints and using them with pastel. But for this particular one, we went ahead and put all of the gouache paints. There's 60 of them, but many of them were these pearl paints I don't use very much. But I picked the best 48 and put them in this 48 set that Arteza also has. It's called a watercolor palette, but it works for gouache as well. I'm speeding up the sketching part, but I will have this little reference photo from pmp-art.com attached to the post for this video. And I'm working with a little, I don't think it's quite a 5x5 square. I've been doing all of these for the 12 days of healing as a 5x5 square, but this was a piece of watercolor paper. I'll describe why I'm using that in a minute, but I think it's probably close to a 4x4. I don't know, it might be a 5x5, but anyway, it's still a square, and we just had so much going on this day that it was a little harder for me to get in the studio, so we literally multitasked by making dinner and me painting at the same time. I was at my kitchen, little island in my kitchen, and my daughter-in-law was helping me cook. I was shouting out instructions for a recipe while painting at the same time. We got to multitask, right, artists? But anyway, so let me describe a little bit about this. This is watercolor paper. Again, I just brought it in. I couldn't bring in my big thing with all the UArt paper and all the other paintings. So I got some watercolor paper. This is the Arteza watercolor paper. And I went ahead and did a little gouache painting. Now this is the set I just showed you where I took all my favorites of all of the 60 and put them in here. The great thing about gouache, there are some differences from watercolor, but there's some similarities too. One of the similarities is that you can squeeze them out like this, obviously, and if they dry, you can use them again, because I wouldn't have done this if they dried up and I couldn't use them again. But that's the same as watercolor. They work fine if you re-wet them after they're dry. One difference about gouache versus watercolor is that it's more opaque. It works very much like pastels. If you watch the last video, session 3, I talked a lot about the differences between watercolor and pastel, and actually gouache has a similarity to pastel in that you can apply, like we typically do with pastels, darks first and then lights. Whereas that's not the way you work with watercolor. You want to preserve your lights. You want to work light to dark with watercolor. You can work dark to light with gouache. You don't have to, but you've got that flexibility of being able to apply. You notice this gouache set has some whites in it, like titanium white, because you can literally use a white on top of another color. You can't do that with watercolor. That's why watercolor sets don't have a white, because you can't really use white with watercolor. You've got to preserve that luminosity. You can probably already tell with that lavender color I put down already. It's very opaque. Notice it doesn't look like watercolor where you can see the luminosity of the paper behind it. And the same thing with this kind of gray-green that I mixed up. I love mixing colors. I know we don't get to do it a lot with pastel. We can by illusion, by what colors we lay down next to each other, and kind of if we layer them very lightly. There are ways you can blend colors. I need to do a video on that with pastels and how you can get the illusion of blended colors or mixed colors like in other mediums. But let me talk a little bit about my reasoning behind these colors that I'm using. Okay, look at the reference photo. That is not at all what you see in the reference photo. Now here's my reasoning. Because gouache can work dark to light, I knew I was going to have a light background. Now, one thing, I love these flowers. I love this photo. It's great. But one thing I don't like, and I usually don't even choose a photo like this, if it looks like it's a studio lighting, because the lighting is everywhere, you don't have any good shadows. You can't tell where your source of light is. So I just improvised with that. I made the light source to the upper left. So you'll see that as I work. I have a shadow in the pot to the lower right. But I knew that the photo had a light background and kind of a little bit of a light tabletop it's on. And so I wanted, like we do with pastels, to get some darks down to have some contrast to the final colors that I was going to lay down. So let me talk first about that lavender background. I wanted, instead of the background to be white like it is in the photo, I wanted to make it a little bit yellowy, pale though, but like the sun. I wanted this like to be a pot sitting out in the sun. So I put down the lavender to have a nice kind of a neutral contrast to this. And notice it's kind of a medium value. So when I add the little almost pale yellow to it, it really is nice. Also too, I didn't mention, I put down not yet, but I will be putting down 2 coats of clear gesso. You'll see me do that in a minute, because just watercolor paper sometimes doesn't have the texture that we need to apply pastels, so you'll notice me doing that. Now as I paint, I'm working on my darks in these leaves, but let me talk a little bit about the other colors. You heard me talk about the background or the sky. The tabletop, once again, it is kind of light, but I need something to contrast the pastel color I put down. So that's why I put down kind of that neutral, darker value, so that it has some character when I put the pastel down. Now, I'm also kind of working a little bit with the pot anyway, with complementary colors. I know I want that pot to be terracotta like it is, so the complement to green is like an orange or a warm color. So I went ahead, and I know I want the pot to have the moss on it that a lot of terracotta pots do that are sitting outside. You know, a lot of my pots do anyway. And so that's why I made it green, or this pretty kind of limey green, or mossy limey green. And I thought that'd be a nice complementary color to put the orange down. If I'd have done this gouache in orange and then I go put orange pastel down, that's going to be pretty boring and not have any interesting play of color. Now this kind of like is it a viridian green? It's kind of like a little bit of a teal blue green. I know I'm going to have some warm green in those leaves, so I thought I'd put down a cool green as my shadows instead of going ahead and doing something warm. And so I'm just getting in kind of my values here. This is in a way a value study in the flower part anyway. And I went ahead and blocked off where the main kind of pansies were. Because this is gouache, I know that I can put some of these colors of the flowers on top of it. But I did leave the bigger flowers, the pansies, kind of blank to add that purpley, or in this case I do a different color. Again, working with some interesting colors here because I know I'm going to apply pastel to it. So for the flowers that are kind of the pansies anyway, actually let me see, which ones was it? No, for the flowers that are kind of on the sides that are going to be red, I thought I'd get down kind of a vibrating kind of a yellow to add the reds. They were kind of a cross between a red and a pink, so I thought that would give some vibrancy to it instead of just painting these red and then putting red on top of it. So I'm thinking about the fact that I'm going to be adding pastel and going ahead and making a palette that's going to complement it and make color much more interesting. And you'll see, well, you saw at the beginning of this video, the final painting ends up being just really vibrant with color. So again, my color choices might look strange right now if you look at the reference photo, but it's kind of a neat way to work if you know you're going to be applying another medium on top of it. Mixed media can be fun in that way. You can do the same thing, of course, with just pastel. We've talked about this before. It's the same concept as putting down a complementary underpainting. You know you're going to be putting a different color on top to make some interesting color. Now, with the pansies, I know they're going to be very bluish purple. And I didn't want to go too crazy. I already got teal in the leaves, so I wanted something a little different. But I decided to go with this magenta. I know that that's kind of a color that will have some interest with the purple. So, and it does show up much more vibrant because I left the white of the paper there than if I'd just covered it all up with that more of a cool green that I used. All right, so I'm going to finish up this little gouache painting, and then you will see that I'm going to apply 2 coats of clear gesso. Now let me talk about that a little bit ahead of time. With clear gesso, if I was doing this on the UArt paper like I've done for the previous sessions, I wouldn't need to apply anything because the paper is sanded. Now this is just watercolor paper, and obviously gouache works great on watercolor paper. However, pastel, I mean, you could apply pastel when this is dry, but it's not going to adhere to it very well. Okay, here's a clear gesso. Because it's such a small little area, I just went ahead and put a little dollop in the middle. There, I'm speeding this up, obviously. I let the first coat dry, then I put on a second coat. Now, because I did 2 coats, it did give it a little bit of a cloudy effect, but not too bad. You can still see the colors underneath. Now, this results in a very textured surface. So I happen to really love this. I don't always create a surface myself that's this textured, but I really did like it in this case. And instead of doing any blending, I just went with the texture. Now you see how I added that little pale yellow to the background, and it lightened up. Of course, the gesso lightened up the background a little bit too, but that yellow did as well. Now, on top of that kind of dull, almost gray green that I had down there, I put a little bit of that blue. Now, the beauty of pastels is the layering creates the vibrancy and also creates it's almost like a 3-dimensional look you get with pastels. Why do I love pastels more than any other medium? I talked about it a little in the last video. It's the richness of color, and it's the boldness, and it's the drama that you can get with it. I feel, well, I know one thing for a fact is a reason for that. Pastels are more pure pigment than any other medium. They have more pigment to binder ratio than any other medium. It's almost pure pigment. And based on which type of pastel you get, some of them have more pigment, meaning pure color. Well, say, for example, think of it as dirt. Or some sort of source where you get the color. It's all of that and very little binder or anything that sticks it together. Whereas other mediums have more binder and you're not getting that richness of color. So that's kind of the neat thing about pastels. I love that. Now I'm putting little samples of the colors I'm using there. I'm getting my darkest darks down for that pot. Now I am going to do a little bit more to that tabletop and add a shadow to the vase. But I got the darkest dark down. My source of light again is going to be in the upper left of the sky. And I'm graduating to lighter values as I'm working here. And I'm keeping in mind that that little lip underneath where the flowers are, it's going to have some leaves that come down and cascade over it, but it's going to be a little bit darker, except for a little spot where the sun highlights on it. But it's going to be a little darker than some of the highlights on the pot where to the left where the sun will be hitting it. So that's all I'm doing here. I'm just getting in the darkest darks where the sun would not be, and then I'm getting in the lightest lights where the sun would hit it. Now that pastel right there is a Great American. They are awesome pastels as far as their softness. They're just buttery and awesome. One thing I don't like about them, their square shape. You really have to work with it for a while until you get them sanded down or chiseled down to where you have a flat edge. They're kind of not real uniform with their shape, but that's okay if you use them a lot, because you'll eventually do that. Again, you'll notice where I'm turning on the lights, where the sun's going to hit, it's hitting on that pot. I'm also moving my pastels to conform to that rounded shape of the pot. I curve it like as if the pastel or my hand was curving around the pot. That gives it that three-dimensionality. Now I'm adding a little bit of that bluish green right there, not only to simulate maybe a little bit of the mossiness that happens, but it's also a great cool shadow color. It gives that a little bit more of that three-dimensional look with a shadow idea. Now that, I believe, might even be a Rembrandt pastel. Notice how you didn't get much pastel at all. That's because you don't get a lot of layering when you do this technique with the clear gesso, and Rembrandts are a harder pastel. Pardon my dog barking in the background. Rembrandts are a harder pastel. Harder pastels usually don't layer as well when you've got, a few layers down. I don't have that many down on this pot, but enough so that Rembrandt didn't work great in application. Now, I'm gradually just adding in some ideas of the moss and also shadows and everything on this pot, and just trying to give it that sense of roundness and three-dimensionality. The pot will be more shadowed underneath. I add the shadow under the pot in just a minute. But watch this and you'll gradually see this come to life. I think I'm going to add a little music at this point, but I'm going to pop back in. I've only sped this up a little bit. Again, my slow Wi-Fi, and also I've got to go get back in my kitchen. So anyway, enjoy this part, but I'm going to come back in when I get to the flowers. This is the point where I'm adding the darkest darks of the flowers. If you look at the reference photo, you'll be able to see that the darkest darks are obviously, just like I'd talk about grasses and things, they're down underneath at the roots before the sun gets to them. And you know they're going to kind of get more congested down at the rim of that pot. So that's why the darkest darks are there. But notice I kind of did that little scumbling effect. I didn't go in and color a solid color. I want that little teal. Now you kind of see why the color choices are working. That little bit of teal is peeking through. Imagine if I'd have just used a kind of a dark green there, and then I went and put my darker value on top. It would have been more boring. So, it's kind of like just a fun play of color. And that's what we're doing as artists. We're playing with color. Now's where I'm using that little bit of a lighter value on that little tabletop to kind of just glaze over. I'm not pressing hard with any of this. I love this gorgeous texture. I wouldn't want to cover that up. So I'm just kind of glazing. Now I'm adding a little bit of a cooler color to simulate a shadow underneath that pot. Notice that's a little bit more blue-purple for the shadow, and it really does give that shadowy effect. I didn't want a dark shadow, but just a little bit. So it's, you're starting to get an idea. I add a little bit of that dark. I think I soften that before I'm done underneath the pot to really give it a sense of weight and heaviness sitting down on the table. Now I've lightened the value of the green because I know these are gradually getting closer to the sun and less congested. They're a little more airy as they get up higher. I'm adding a little bit of that down. I know some of these leaves are cascading over. They're gonna be lighter. Some of them, the sun just kind of flits on a few of them, but they do need something dark to hang on to. So that's why I did that medium green for some of the leaves kind of coming over the pot. So I'm just kind of working in, out, and around, keeping a very loose, painterly, impressionistic feel. I'm looking a lot at the reference photo and seeing the gestural quality of those flowers and just keeping them fun. I'm trying to apply the principles of one of the videos I did not too long ago, what I talk about, forced randomness. I'm trying to create the flowers so they don't have a pattern, so they are spontaneous and free and reaching in various directions rather than getting in a habit of all the flowers facing in the same way and the same color and value. Isn't that monotonous? Just my voice was monotonous there. So now I've gotten an even lighter value of green. This green is warmer. Notice the ones I've used already have been a little bit cooler in color temperature. Not quite as cool as that teal I put down with the gouache, but they're gradually getting warmer because the sun is reaching to these outer leaves. So that's why you build up your layers so that, again, you get that three-dimensionality that is inherent with soft pastels if you use them correctly and layer. I had a little bit more bright orange there for the sun. Now I have been, in all of these in the series, I've been making little color samples, coloring them in a little bit on an index card so you can see what the color looks like. I did run out of room there, but later you'll see I added another index card and I do show all these colors that I use. So if you want to try to, recreate this painting, go a little bit more towards the end of the painting and you'll see where I show all of the colors that I used. And it doesn't matter if you do this on with a gouache underpainting or pastel underpainting or no underpainting at all, or you want to do something totally different. I would like it if you do recreate these 12 days of healing sessions that you, I decided to call them sessions because it sounds like a healing session, not a challenge, So, but if you do decide to do it, I'd like it if you stick with the reference material, like flowers or a pot of flowers, just like the one before was pears, something fruit, you know, something like that. It'd be nice if we all kind of have something a little bit similar. I love the fact that you guys are posting in the Google album. It's our shared Google album for the 12 Days of Healing. Please comment on these posts when I put them on my Patreon page. Let me know if you guys are liking that. I can do more of that. There's one thing I do like about that. I like how you open up the album. You can see all the photos as a group, all of us. I know I could do that in Facebook as an album in Facebook, but it doesn't give the same impact as the Google album for some reason. I think the photos don't show up as big, and also we have some of our patrons that are not on Facebook, so they wouldn't be able to participate. So you know, let me know what you think of that, being able to share albums like that. Okay, so now you can see I'm just gradually adding color. And again, very impressionistic. Notice I'm not even making, you know, very specific flower shapes. I'm keeping them very nondescript, working the same way I did with the leaves. Notice how I went with the darker reds first for the reds that I did, a deeper red, and now I'm adding the brighter, turning the lights on, and so to speak. I also, you notice you still can kind of see behind some of those red flowers on the outer edges of the flowers. You see a little bit of that yellow still showing through. I didn't want to cover all that up. I just thought it was really interesting. So I decided to make this almost like a rainbow pot of flowers. Working in a little bit now the centers of those pansies. I know there's a really dark purple at the center, and then later I'm going to add that little yellow, the very center of the flower, a little a popping yellow color. And then I'm gradually getting more of those purples. Notice I had put down the magentas with gouache. Now I'm just scumbling in some purples, and I'm gradually, same as before, I'm getting to the little lighter purples. Pansies have a little combination of a purpley blue going on. But again, that magenta behind it, you know, gives a little interest to it, makes it more creative with color. So this painting altogether, after the gouache application, only took about maybe 30 minutes. So I think it's really neat how if you plan your sketch, if you get a good sketch, if you're going to do something like this that requires a sketch, if you get a good underpainting probably took about 10 minutes, your painting process can be relatively quick because you've done a lot of the labor at the beginning, and then you're just having fun with color. So again, you can see I'm turning on the lights now. I've got that outer layer of light that the sun is hitting. You've got those deeper colors down in towards the center of those flowers and the center of that pot. And notice the three-dimensionality of that really coming to life. Now, I know I still have that teal showing through. That's the gouache at the upper part of those flowers. But I don't know. I just kind of liked it. I covered up a little bit more. I think I do. Yeah, see, I added those, I added some new pastels, those longer sticks you see to the right. But I realized I didn't want to add a whole lot of those. They weren't really adding a whole lot to it. I wasn't getting that crisp line. I wanted to add some kind of crisp, viney type of lines coming and going in that. But it wasn't really, I think I maybe overlayered or whatever, so it wasn't really working the way I had hoped. Now this painting is getting close to being done. Notice I add the little yellows to the centers of the pansies. I'm adding a little bit more of the teals and kind of that grassy green. I did speed this up a bit more, but you can see I'm keeping it all very light and airy. A little bit of the orangey reds. And notice here how I use this lighter pastel that I used to glaze over at the beginning, the background. I use it kind of like sky holes to carve in to the leaves and the flowers to give it a little bit more of an airy feeling. So wrapping this up now, this was a lot of fun. I hope you try it. I hope you'll share it in our Google album. I love seeing all of your paintings all together like that. So I pray you guys are all safe and blessed, and I can't wait to be back for session number 5. Please try this, and happy painting.